Alex Zaharov-Reutt and Talkin' Tech on today's News Talk, TNT.
Thank you for joining me again on Talking Tech with Alex Zaharov-Reutt here on TNTRadio.live. Now it's time for my second interview. I'm joined by Elliot Dellys. He is the CEO of Australian but world-class cybersecurity company Phronesis Security, with Elliot cleverly styling himself as a Chief Realist. Welcome to TNTRadio.live.
Good to be here, Alex.
Thanks for taking the time. Now, Elliot, despite a plethora of cybersecurity companies out there and cybersecurity teams within companies, the news of ransomware attacks, of password leaks, of hacks of major companies, government departments, and more are regularly featuring on the news. So what is your wrap on the cyber war being waged globally?
I think the predominant feature of the cyber war is an ongoing swing of the pendulum in favor of the defender and the attacker. There's three key reasons why this has been a perennial feature in cybersecurity. The first is organizations extract value from data by sharing it and using it. So there's always this tension between how do you extract value from the data and make sure that the right people have access to it while also keeping it under lock and key. Secondly, there is an inherent imbalance between the attacker and the defender. The attacker only needs to get it right once, whereas the defender has to get it right 100% of the time to prevent a breach. And thirdly, as well, a really important part of cybersecurity is it's all about tech. And over the last 20 years, we've seen an incredible pace of change in technology. So every time we've developed a new defensive technology, a new way of catching hackers, hackers out there are spending just as much time and energy finding new ways to bypass those controls and deceive people and trick people into clicking links or whatever it might be. And I think we're going to continue to see this. And there's two good examples of that recently. The first is ransomware, right? Traditional ransomware was kind of like smash and grab, get in, cause the damage, extort, and get out. And then as teams start to get better and better at detecting this, we start to see things like initial access brokering and second and third party extortion. And then, of course, these new malicious decryption companies that come along and pretend that they're here to help you when actually they're just an offshoot of one of these ransomware as a service gangs. But we also see this with password security, for example. We used to have short, simple passwords that then started to get defeated by dictionary attacks. So we started to build longer, complex passwords, and then attackers came up with rainbow tables. So we introduced MFA, and now we see some really clever MFA bypasses, things like evil proxy, or even just user fatigue, where you just get slammed with a notification again and again till you go, I just don't want to see it anymore. Click it, make it go away. Yeah. If it works, it works. And this is something that is going to be a perennial feature of the cyber conflict.
Now, one of the things we see around about this time of the year, from late December to about now, is predictions of how the year is going to roll out. Now, just yesterday on LinkedIn, you had a top 10 list of cybersecurity predictions for 2024. So, anyone can type Elliot Dellys into LinkedIn to read them all, but what is the overall summary and what are the top three that we can talk about right now?
Well, look, in Australia, one of the big things that we've seen is a lot of focus on privacy legislation. So, for example, in 2018, the European Parliament passed GDPR, which really set the gold standard for data protection and privacy. And one of the big sticks and the carrots and the sticks of GDPR was making sure that organizations would be held to account through regulatory fines if they did the wrong thing. Australia used to have actually one of the lowest fines in the world for privacy breach at a cap of only 2.2 million. And last year, we saw that cap raised to $50 million. And now, off a couple of years of some really severe incidents, one of the big things I think that organizations in Australia, but realistically around the world, are going to have to deal with is how do you manage a corporate culture where the expectation is that if I entrust my data to you as an organization, it's on you to know where it's stored, who has access to it, and if I request copies of my information, you know the right people to ask to retrieve it. Most importantly as well, one of the big things that we're seeing that is becoming an increasing area of focus, especially in Australia, is the right to be forgotten. If you no longer need access to my data anymore, how do I have confidence that you're going to get rid of it? And for a lot of organizations that have these large, complex digital estates, that can actually be a pretty daunting question. So I think we're going to see an increasing cultural shift towards organizations having an expectation put upon them that they know exactly where that data is stored and how to get rid of it if it's no longer required.
Yeah. Now, I want to get a couple more from you, but how is AI being used by cyber criminals to defeat protections? You already mentioned evil proxy and some of the ways to defeat MFA or multi factor authentication, which is quite scary because that's the whole purpose of multi-factor authentication, multiple ways of proving who you are. And then so, how are you and others using AI to defeat the bad guys?
Well, look, AI and machine learning more broadly is not new in the world of cybersecurity. Heuristic antivirus has been using it for a long time. That being said, generative AI using these huge data sets is something that's potentially going to be transformative. So things where I think in the next year we're going to see some really potentially scary developments, for example, is in the development of deepfake audio and video. For common attack vectors like business email compromise and password reset attacks, what do you do when you live in a world where if you get a phone call or if you receive a video call, it looks like me, it sounds like me, but it might be the product of a generative AI tool? That is a really difficult problem to solve. So I think leveraging the power of these AI tools for social engineering attacks is something where we're going to see attackers really starting to get a bit of an advantage. On the defensive side, I think we're going to see a lot more sophistication around things like anomaly detection and sentiment analysis, being able to do things like detect deprecated accounts that are no longer required and maintaining more visibility of that digital estate. But I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of 2024, a lot of cybersecurity is attackers and defenders launching their respective AI tools at each other and just trying to be one step ahead.
Yeah, that sounds very much like what it's going to be like. So what is your second big prediction for 2024?
So look, my second big prediction on the AI theme really relates to the massive rush that organizations have currently been having to get on board with AI. So if we cast our mind back to, say, 2017, 2018, there was the great cloud migration. Every organization under the sun was doing its cloud migration strategy. We want to get away from on-prem infrastructure. Cloud is going to be the solution to all of our problems. So then what did we see over the next few years? Unauthenticated S3 buckets getting compromised, misconfigured cloud instances, lots of shadow cloud IT infrastructure, because organizations didn't really put the time in to plan what that meant in the long term. I think there's a real risk that we'll see the same thing when it comes to AI adoption. Organizations not providing users with adequate guidance about what they can or they can't put into these large language models, or not using large language models that are appropriate for their data sovereignty or privacy requirements, or simply just not knowing where that data is going. And I think in 2024, we may well see the first compromise of a large AI platform provider. And when that happens, it might be a bit of a wake-up call to everyone that's jumped on the bandwagon that, hey, we might want to think about the security here. Because, I mean, look, let's be honest, there is a real risk of being left behind. And I think a lot of organizations at the moment are so focused on wanting to keep up that it might take a bit of a wake-up call to go, actually, maybe we should slow down and consider the security implications of doing this.
Yes, taking a breath, slowing down, judging where you're going, what you're doing. Never bad advice. That's
always good advice.
Now, you've got 7 other predictions, but what's the third one that you want to highlight today?
I think the third one that I'd like to talk about is the cyber poverty line. So the cyber poverty line is an idea that, cybersecurity has traditionally been sort of defined by the haves and the have-nots. So, for example, in Australia, the Australian Signals Directorate produced some data recently that indicated that it was actually medium-sized businesses that were the most severely impacted by breaches. And there's some fairly simple logic behind that. If you're an attacker, you want to be able to get a good payoff for the time and energy you put into compromising an organization. So you want an organization that's large enough that they can afford to pay a ransom if you get in. On the other hand, if your organization isn't large enough to be able to afford a dedicated cybersecurity team or regular engagement with consultants, it can be really difficult to get that balance right. So for those organizations that sit in that Goldilocks zone of being large enough to be a juicy target, but not large enough to be able to invest heavily in cybersecurity, they have a real risk of falling behind as the attackers get more and more sophisticated. We also see a similar issue, for example, with not-for-profits. So the expectation for most people that donate to a not-for-profit is, for every dollar I donate, I want to see, all going to the programs that they do, which makes sense. If you donate money to a charity, you want to have confidence that there's going to be a real impact off the back of that. The problem is that for a lot of these not-for-profits, they handle very sensitive information. They have to share this information sometimes with a wide variety of stakeholders, but they also have to run off, the smell of an oily rag. So being able to put the time and the money aside to be able to improve their cybersecurity posture can be a really serious issue. And so, for example, in Australia, the 2030 strategy, the first shield is about making sure that small and medium businesses don't fall behind. But what we really need to seriously consider is, well, who's going to foot the bill for that? And how are we going to make sure that we're providing real, tangible guidance to these organizations and not just providing another list of controls and regulatory obligations they're going to struggle to be able to implement?
Now, you mentioned before that people had insecure S3 Amazon buckets and there were deprecated accounts that people may be using. But when an organization, business or a government or department contacts you, what are the most common things that you see in the security audits that people are just missing out on, not really paying attention to and not taking care of, thus necessitating your services?
Yeah, well, look, we work with organizations of all shapes and sizes across all different industries, but there's usually some common themes. The first one I would say is a poor risk management culture. And what I mean by that is, every organization under the sun has done a risk assessment at some point, but a lot of organizations kind of miss the point of why we do risk assessments. I often say the point of doing a risk assessment is to make sure that you're not only spending $10,000 on a $100,000 problem and you're not wasting $100,000 on a $10,000 problem. And this is really what a good, mature risk management practice is about. It's about making sure you're getting the best possible return on investment from your security budget. So we work quite closely with organizations to make sure that they're spending their time, their money, their energy on those issues that are most likely to cause a security incident in the next 6 to 12 months, and stop worrying about all the little things that actually can wait their turn fundamentally. The second one that we see a lot of is just a lack of visibility of the environment. Going back to what I was saying before around, managing the digital estate. If you go to an organization, you say, what data do you hold? Where do you store it? Who has access to it? And how do you have confidence that if someone was to come and say, I want my data purged, you know how to do it? It can actually be quite a difficult problem to solve. And this is also true when it comes to just asset management more broadly. A lot of organizations understand the importance of vulnerability management, patching their infrastructure. But when it actually comes time to understanding where all that infrastructure is, especially for large enterprise organizations, there's often a lot of blind spots. So that's another area where for organizations large and small, we often work with them to make sure that they've got good visibility of their environment. So if a vulnerability does pop up, you identify it before the attacker. The third one that I'd say is a really common issue relates to governance. So if we're talking about risk management, we're talking about improving visibility of the estate. When you do find an issue, do people know who's accountable for getting it done? And do you have a clear and actionable way of tracking it in the mid to long term? A lot of the time we work with organizations that have really passionate people. They've got great skills, great technology. They've got good processes in place, but actually just being able to make sure that people know who's responsible for what, and you're not doing this thing when it comes time to remediation. It's another issue that we often find ourselves sort of guiding organizations through that process.
Yeah. Now, as the CEO of a major security company, I'm imagining that yourself and your fellow executives and pretty much anyone in the organization would be the subject of attacks. You'd be a juicy target. So what sort of attacks have happened to you and how do you defend against those?
Yeah, look, certainly we have targets in our heads. I mean, fundamentally, we face the exact same threats as any other organization. I think the thing that probably makes us a little different is because our organization is composed of people who are very, very cybersecurity conscious. We do have an exceptional level of vigilism, and I have a very high degree of confidence that my staff are eternally on the lookout for attacks when they come in. That being said, we have an expectation, and obviously our clients have an expectation that we have a zero tolerance for compromise. So we always have to be very, very cautious. So some of the measures that we put in place, for example, is we've found that often when we're onboarding new staff, people will try to impersonate their managers to try and get new staff to click links, obviously assuming that the new staff haven't done their full onboarding yet. So we've actually introduced controls specifically to mitigate that sort of risk. And look, on a personal level, I've had 2 identity fraud attack attempts against me over the last 12 months. One of them actually involved me ending up on the phone with the attacker as they were impersonating me. And the real lesson for me for that was, even if you know everything that needs to be done if you're a victim of one of these attacks, once your data's out there as a result of a data breach, there's actually not a whole lot you can do other than be ready to act when something goes wrong. And so, look, when it comes to cybersecurity, we want to stay out of the headlines for having a breach as much as any other organization.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, I was buying something from someone on Gumtree today, and as I normally do, I'm showing them tips on how to use their smartphone better, whether it's an iPhone or an Android. And one of the things we looked at was when was the last time they did an update. Now, they had a Galaxy S20, so a slightly older device now, and they were on Android 11 with the last security update, the patch from January 1, 2020. So I said, that's already 4 years out of date. And we had a look, and there was an update available to go to Android 12 from Android 11. And of course, we're now on Android 14. And what I've seen with Samsung devices in the past, and I don't know what it is like at this very second, but in the past, you had to do one update, then you had to check again to do the next update and the next update. I mean, on the iPhones, it normally goes straight to the latest one, and it's probably like that on the latest Samsung devices as well. But how often do you see that executives, business people, government people have out of date smartphones and tablets, or even out of date Windows and Mac installations? Obviously, it's very big for companies to patch their infrastructure and their computers, but on a personal level, those are pretty serious vectors of attack too.
Absolutely. Look, for organizations that use MDM solutions like Intune, it's fairly easy to maintain an up-to-date fleet of mobile devices. Where this gets complicated, obviously, is when you're talking about BYOD, because then if you're dealing with different operating systems, different handsets, it's very, very common to have devices with a whole range of issues, which includes out-of-date operating systems. So obviously, as you've alluded to, having devices that aren't patched opens you up to vulnerabilities. And let's say, for example, in the finance sector, one of the big issues is screen overlay Trojans. So that's something that's a major issue when it comes to mobile devices. But I think the biggest issue when it comes to, how enterprises manage their users' use of mobile devices, it's just that we're much more complacent when it comes to mobile devices. We're so used to getting a message and clicking a link, and we constantly have them in front. There's a degree of trust and familiarity that lets us lower our guard. And so, we often find users will do things like download unsanctioned software that's often very leaky and collects and transmits a broad range of data from the device without your knowledge. Or we find people will connect to unsecured Wi-Fi networks, or even sometimes put credentials into a site that otherwise, if they visited through a workstation or a laptop, they might just be a little more alert. So that's one of the main issues that we see when it comes to managing a fleet of mobile devices, is just maintaining that same degree of alertness that you would have when you're using, an enterprise laptop.
Elliot, I have a couple more questions for you, but we need to take a quick break. This is TNT Radio.
De-weaponizing weather with reality and perspective.
The cyclone that's in the north of Australia is kind of unusual for an El Nino season. That's because we have not really had an El Nino season this year in Australia. The Southern Oscillation Index, the longest running measure of the ENSO, or El Nino, La Nina, has not cooperated at all. And we knew this was a problem way back in the Northern Hemisphere fall and our spring, because we weren't seeing a lot of typhoons. Usually when you have a big El Nino, you have a lot of typhoons going off, and we had the third lowest typhoon production on record, so something funky was going on. However, that Southern Oscillation Index is going to crash for the month of February, which means that our fall should be average in Australia. Now, I'm bringing all this up because that crash in February is linked to severe cold in the United States and Europe for February into March. And we're seeing another ferocious storm attacking Norway now. A lot of heavy rain is coming into Europe over the next week. Now, the two times that happened, it turned frigid in Europe. Same thing is going to happen. Mid-February to mid-March will be frigid in Europe. You see all these storms crashing into the United States? Well, guess what? It's going to turn frigid in the United States. In fact, for much of the United States, the worst of the winter is on the way. And just think, it all hinges on looking at the weather around Australia. Isn't that nice? Hands across the water. Australia, the States, and Europe. Kumbaya. This is TNT climate and weather watchdog meteorologist Joe Bastardi asking you to enjoy the weather. It's the only weather you've got.
Alex Zaharov-Reutt and Talkin' Tech on today's News Talk, TNT.
Thank you for being with us here on a Saturday night, or wherever you are around the world, or watching live on or watching on a replay. Now, Elliot, I've looked up what phronesis means, but for those who are wondering, it isn't a clever wordplay on Game of Thrones. So what does it mean, and how did you decide to use this as your company name?
So look, I'm a bit of a philosophy nerd, and phronesis is a concept from ancient Greek philosophy that roughly translates as practical wisdom. So the Greeks had this great idea that knowledge in and of itself isn't valuable. It's how you apply knowledge that creates value. And for me, this is a beautiful analogy, both for cybersecurity more broadly, but also our company's personal mission of cybersecurity for good. So in cybersecurity, like I alluded to earlier, we work with organizations that have, really sophisticated technology, passionate people, well-developed policies and procedures, But the real challenge often is bringing all of these together to make sure that it's fit for purpose. So a lot of the time what we're doing is we're working with organizations to make sure they're communicating effectively with stakeholders, they're measuring and tracking risk, they're building pragmatic, achievable cybersecurity strategies. Because, all of the knowledge is there, but we want to make sure they can apply it in the most meaningful and impactful way. And fundamentally, cybersecurity needs to be a business enabler and not getting in the way. So that's how you make sure that wisdom is practical. The other side of this as well is we have a mission, which is what we call cybersecurity for good. And as part of this, we donate 10% of the company's profits to 3 amazing charities that do incredible work in Australia. And our view is, when it comes to a lot of issues, say like climate change, maybe you believe in it, maybe you don't, but chances are you've heard of it. The time for awareness raising has more or less come and gone. What we need is immediate practical action, and our impact model of donating money to some of these really impactful charities. They're some of the most impactful for a dollar in all of Australia. That's what Phronesis is all about.
Sure. And is that part of the B Corp certification, which you were the first security company to achieve in Australia?
Yeah, so the B Corp certification was a fantastic process for us, not only to be able to refine the model that we'd come up with, but actually identify a whole host of other ways that we could create impact. It's actually one of these things that I say to other business leaders, even if you don't intend on getting certified, just going through the process of filling out the B Corp roadmap and doing what they call the business impact assessment is a really, really cool process, because you can spot all these opportunities to do good and create impact that come at no cost to the organization, but just help you consider things that otherwise might have been a bit out of sight, out of mind. Look, one example is the Queensland government a few years ago produced a report called the Not Now, Not Ever report that was all about tackling domestic violence. And one of the key recommendations of this report was that private companies could create dedicated leave types for victims of domestic violence, which are discreet enough that, it doesn't come up on the employment records or anything, but allows people to do things like attend court hearings or go to police stations or whatever it is they have to do without having to use their personal leave. And for me personally, this was just simply an issue I wasn't aware of. But when I encountered this and then going through the B Corp process, it talked about, well, what measures do you have in place to support victims of domestic violence? I went, well, fantastic. We can adopt this very, very easily. And this is one of the reasons why I really am such a believer in B Corp, because it's just a way of being able to add a degree of rigor and an audit process to what you're trying to do to achieve impact that allowed us to not only go, yes, look, what we say we're doing is independently verified, our impact model has been put through the ringer, but also it's given us an opportunity to find a whole bunch of other things that we can do that otherwise we might never have thought of.
And are you going to implement some sort of a generative AI component into your security dashboard that allows people to talk to the Phronesis dashboard as though it was one of your staff and get a rundown of how the business is going security-wise?
Look, we've been exploring different ways of using generative AI. I'm a huge proponent of it. Look, I was using ChatGPT the first week it came out, and I thought, wow, This is going to be a game changer, especially in the world of GRC. That being said, I do believe in human beings. I think that ChatGPT and other generative AI tools can be incredible productivity enhancers, but we really run the risk of, I suppose, underestimating the value of a human being. So we're using generative AI tools to increase our productivity, but fundamentally, our clients work with us because they want a human being with years of experience and appropriate qualifications to be able to vet and validate information. And it's absolutely critical to us that we have a human being in that. So look, we're not going to have a dashboard where we replace consultants with generative AI anytime soon, but we've certainly been looking at ways that we can adopt it to make, past cost savings onto our clients.
Well, Elliot Dellys, the CEO and Chief Realist of Phronesis Security, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your story with the global audience of TNT Radio. And I look forward to chatting again soon.
My pleasure, Alex. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for joining me here on TNTRadio.live. I'm looking forward to being with you, Chris Smith, next Wednesday at 4:30 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time. And I'll join you here for episode 4 next Saturday. Thank you very much, and this is TNTRadio.live.
To hear a replay of this hour, go to episodes at TNTRadio.live. Now, Alex Zaharov-Reutt and Talkin' Tech on today's News Talk TNT.